welcome everyone to Catholic Prison Ministries Coalition's monthly webinar. This month, we're going to be talking about ministering to Native Americans and First Nations peoples. So with that, I'd like us to take a moment to open with prayer before we begin our webinar today. So if you find yourself in a good spot, I invite you to, for a moment, to close your eyes. Take a few deep breaths. As we call to mind other distractions that might be with us today, things that may pull our attention away. And we release those with each breath. We remind ourselves to be where our feet are, and to recognize that the ground we walk on has been and always will be sacred for the many stories that have inhabited these spaces before us and those who will be here to come. God, we ask that you walk with us today during our conversation. Inspire us to be ministers of justice and peace to the populations we serve. In your name we pray, amen. So with that, I'd like to pass it on off to Father Mike, Father Chris, and Ty. They'll say a few words about themselves and they'll take us through their presentation. So Father Mike, I'll hand it off to you first.
Yeah, good morning or good afternoon. I'm Father Michael Carson. I'm the Assistant Director for Native American Affairs, the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops. I have actually two functions here at the conference. One, I'm the staff person to the Subcommittee of Bishops, or Subcommittee of Native American Affairs. The other job I have is to help coordinate missions, churches, and schools, mostly on reservations of those who cater to Native American indigenous population.
Hello, my name is Father Christopher Kerstiens, and good afternoon and or good morning to everybody who's come to this webinar. And I live and work on both the Laguna and Acoma Native American reservations here in New Mexico. And I'm assistant pastor here at St. Joseph's Parish in both Laguna and Acoma. And I'm also involved in ministry to the incarcerated throughout New Mexico, which is supposed to resume pretty soon, but it's kind of happening in fits and starts and all. I've been here in Laguna and Acoma now for a little almost 6 years, but not continuously. But I was involved in ministry of the incarcerated in one form or another for about 10 years. And I'm very, very happy to be here on this. And I'm very happy that this webinar will begin to talk about the needs of Native Americans who are incarcerated, and also talk about their communities. And I also hope people will learn a thing or two about Catholic Native Americans who have been, Catholics for many, many generations, mostly unknown to most people.
Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Titus Fragura. I am from the Pueblo of Jemez, which is about 50 miles north of Albuquerque. I am full-blooded Native American Pueblo Jemez, and I am currently a social worker working under a protective services specialist, and I was previously a probation officer. But also, I'm going to talk about my experiences, my own personal experiences, incarceration, and so that's what I'm going to talk about in this present or this webinar here. And well, thank you everybody for joining. All right.
Thank you all for your introductions. Father Mike, I'll pass it off to you to start the presentation.
Okay, first, I'm not a lawyer. So if anybody was thinking about legal advice on Native Americans, that's not me. I'm here just to give you some background of the criminal justice system, especially how it affects indigenous Native communities. First, the US criminal justice system with Natives face very different problems from the general population, especially different problems from cultural families. This is caused by history, culture, and regional aspects. In many cases, challenges are different than any other incarcerated populations, and therefore they need to be handled with different approaches to minister to the needs of the Native American community. Okay, to understand various concerns and problems with Indigenous, you have to understand the basics in terms of the US government's relationship with the Native communities. And that's what's classified in big terms as the trustee relationship, Because of doctrine of discovery and other legal concepts, the federal government automatically has a title of all Native land even before a treaty existed. What Natives have is the ability to live on the land legally and to govern its usage with certain respects. What treaties do is to make government responsible for certain services such as education, law enforcement, criminal justice, and medical care. It's like the agreement that you have certain aspects to our land where you do that, the Natives sign off on the treaty and they get services in order to compensate for the loss of land. And those services are addressed in the treaty itself. Tribal courts and governments have limited sovereignty. It is the federal government that has the last word. So even though we have a treaty relationship, our trustee relationship, we have to remember always that the federal government has the last word and any say with Native Americans. And only the rights in treaty can be regulated by the federal government. And that's very important. That's why Native communities have gambling, because very few treaties would address the idea of gambling. So therefore, the federal government cannot regulate gambling. Now, the federal government, in terms of treaty, has certain powers in respect to all things they can regulate. And then with that, they can give to the state's authority also the power to regulate as long as it's specified in the treaty. Further, reservations and land titles held by the federal government. It's very important. Like all land the federal government owns, they have agencies to manage it with certain rules that apply. Natives living on reservations are akin to people living on national parks or any other federal property. The trustee relationship has the idea, and think about it as a child and a parent, the federal government being the parent. The federal government historically have treated Natives in the same way as children needing care. Okay, let's talk about the recent Oklahoma decision. Originally, when tribes say that the federal government has a way to, or has a right to regulate criminal justice and law enforcement on treaty land, that includes only what's called major crimes. And those crimes are spelled out. And they are the original 7 are murder, manslaughter, rape, assault with intent to kill, arson, burglary, and larceny. So the federal government has the responsibility to investigate those crimes and then punish the offenders. All other crimes, then the tribal government, tribal police, and tribal entities have jurisdiction over. However, they have been added recently 7 more offenses, including kidnapping, incest, assault with a dangerous weapon, assault resulting in serious bodily injury, assault with intent to commit rape, robbery, and felony sexual molestation of a minor. Although the intent of the federal government is to permit punishment for major crimes by Indians against other Native Americans, major crimes also are investigated and punished by Native Americans against other ethnic groups, even non-natives. Now, what the Oklahoma decision says is that this usually just applies to tribal members living on reservations. The Oklahoma decision says all these major crimes, if you're a tribal member, it's the responsibility of the federal government to investigate and to punish, if needed, for these crimes, even if you're not on a reservation. If you're a tribal member, even if you're saying you live in New York or living in San Francisco or Los Angeles, if you're a tribal member, it's up to the federal government, not the states, to investigate these crimes, and the criminal justice system, the federal criminal justice system applies not the states. That's a very important decision for Oklahoma. It kind of broadens the aspects of all these crimes and investigation and punishment away from the states and into the federal government. Okay, let's talk about some of the problems that arise in this. One of the serious problems that I've been working on is Native juvenile offenders. Now, if we have major crimes being investigated and being punished by the federal government, even juveniles, if they have these major crimes, are investigated and persecuted, are prosecuted by the federal government. That means that Natives, juveniles, are the largest population in federal prisons in the country, far above in any other cultural group. Why is this a problem? Okay, there's a number of problems of incarcerating so many Native juveniles. The first one, juvenile sentences are oftentimes harsher in the federal system than their state counterparts, because often the federal system does not make a distinction between adults and juveniles. They just punish them the same way. The places of incarceration are often far from their homes, so parents cannot visit. Because the federal government actually does not have juvenile prisons, so they contract out to states and also private prisons. So these juveniles from reservations often get to send away hundreds of miles or even thousands of miles from their community. Many juveniles are victims of older inmates. There's a lack of oversight in where juvenile offenders are housed by the federal government. And there's a lack of integration services back to the community. Reservations are usually poor, are always poor. And so therefore the federal government does not supply the reentry programs that a lot of states do, especially for juvenile offenders. Let's talk about some of the cultural concerns. The federal government houses inmates, juveniles and otherwise, with many different tribes. There's assumption that all native tribes are part of one culture. In fact, when we say natives or Native Americans, we just imply there's one culture. But in reality, natives are from many different cultures. The term native or indigenous is like saying European. We would not automatically assume a person from England is exactly the same culture-wise as somebody from Belarus. Putting all the tribes together in a detention facility makes it difficult to match the cultural and spiritual needs even those wish or desire to do so. Addition, although most natives and indigenous speak English, many are more comfortable speaking their own native language. Because native languages are so few, there's not an incentive for the federal government to invest in staff that are fluent in many different languages. And last, most natives and indigenous are part of what's called the restorative justice culture. That the criminal justice, and we talked about this before in different seminars or webinars, criminal justice is actually a European idea, mostly English idea. It was brought over to the US, but indigenous communities for thousands of years had the idea of restorative justice rather than criminal justice. And we see that in my work with the Navajo. I saw that very clearly. The Navajo has what's called family peace courts, in which if you have a juvenile offender or any offenders, they bring the families together to solve and work out the problem. And especially in Navajo spirituality, we talk about going from displacement from things that are in chaos to something that are simple and out of that chaos. And that's the entire idea of what restorative justice does, is the idea of going from a chaotic situation into something more healing. Okay. Basic poverty issues. A couple of years ago, we had a symposium, a 4-day symposium of all the experts of Native American poverty at the Notre Dame. And we had some 4 days to talk about not only the issues of Native American poverty, but what to do about it. In terms of criminal justice, poverty limits the opportunities and choices within the Native community. Poverty is based on 3 major areas on reservations. First, the trustee relationship. As I talked about earlier, Natives do not own their land. Therefore, they cannot get loans because they can't use the land as collateral and it can't improve their lives. Reservations are usually, not always, but usually where land is less value and far from urban areas, doesn't have a lot of resources on the land. Racism denies unemployment or denies people to get employed. And education by all factors on reservations is the poorest in the country, except for Catholic schools, which are some of the best in the country. But BIE schools, Bureau of Indian Education schools, are some of the worst in the country. Unemployment, when I was working on the Navajo reservation, unemployment was 86%, and some reservations are up to 90% unemployment. Although poverty is not a cause for criminal behavior, it tends to lead to activity that's more apt for incarceration and incarceration for longer times. Poverty does not allow individuals to avail themselves to all their rights under the law. So if a poor person compared to a wealthy person has more opportunities to avail themselves under law throughout the criminal justice process. Okay, drugs and alcohol. I think of all the concerns of natives, this is not the first on my list because it really runs itself into stereotypes. I'm working with the Navajo on the reservation. There are very few alcoholics, although I did work with some, but that's unfortunately one of the stereotypes. In my work with the Navajo, alcohol cannot be brought on the reservation, but it could be drank. Drinking it was legal. And unfortunately, there was a large liquor store right outside the reservation for in Navajo to buy as much liquor as they want. More of a problem in talking with tribal police, which were in my parish when I was there, is the vastness of the Navajo Nation and being very close to the Mexican border. Think about the Navajo Nation as being about the size of Connecticut. And it's true, you can drive for literally 100 miles and not see another car, another house. And they have about the same amount of police as the city of San Jose to have that vast area. And with so few police and this vast area, it's a problem of Mexican gangs that hide drugs on the Navajo Nation. And the Navajo police would talk about that as a major problem. Okay, in conclusion, what can we do? There's a number of steps in terms of advocacy and even in terms of ministry that we can do. One is, and a lot of Native communities are doing this, is moving from a criminal justice model, which is very much foreign, both in terms of culture and people, into a restorative justice model, again, concentrating on solving problems. Reduce poverty, improve the school system on reservations. Increase tribal control of the inmates and their legal system. Work with areas where racism can be removed. We're doing that very well at the USCCB with our pastoral letter, Open Wide Our Hearts. We need to get the word out. A lot of problems and difficulties exist with the criminal justice system, especially with Native incarceration of juveniles, just because people do not know about it. So if we can get the word out that that is a problem, we're more apt to reduce the population of juveniles, Native juveniles in the federal prison system. And of course, it goes back to stop or reduce the level of juveniles in the federal system. It doesn't help the juveniles and it's very destructive to Native American communities. Bring more cultural programs and staff trained in Native cultures into detention, and cultures being plural. As I said before, there's a lot of Native cultures and a lot of them are very vast and very different. So we can't have one person trained in one culture and expect that person to be ready to handle a different Native cultures, that they really need to be trained being culturally specific. Okay, that is my presentation, and I'll give it back to Jared.
Thank you, Father Mike. I really appreciate sharing some of the information and the stories behind those numbers and your experiences. Father Chris, I'd like to hand it off to you to share share some of your wisdom with us all.
Well, I'm not sure if I have a lot of wisdom, but I have a lot of experience. Before I was ordained, I was ordained a priest. I was asked by my provincial minister to get into ministry to the incarcerated here in the state of New Mexico in general. And it came as quite a surprise because I've always been interested and involved in ministry of the incarcerated, whether here in New Mexico and, in different ways also in Texas when I was studying theology. But I was asked to spearhead kind of a Franciscan style ministry to the incarcerated, in the state of New Mexico primarily. And that's what I commenced, that's what I basically started to do. And, prior to that, I did have experience here in the different pueblos and also the Navajo Nation, but until I got involved in a ministry, in general to the Hispano population here in New Mexico, as well as the other populations here, I began to really realize from the get-go that Native Americans, particularly the Pueblos and the Apache and the Navajo that I've worked with a few Papago and all at different times. That their needs were, that knowing that they were not all the same by any means. Father Michael is completely right in saying that, Native Americans may share, common values, but they speak very different languages and they have very different cultures from each other. And that's important for people to realize. And I began to realize that they had their own particular needs. For instance, a Pueblo Native American might be separated from the ceremonial complex in which he or she lives, with its different cycles, its different dances, its different prayers, and all, which are distinctly different, for instance, from the religious life of Navajos, for instance, and even Apaches and all. Very often or not, when they're incarcerated, they don't have a direct contact with the different religious societies that are within these different groups, or those, let's call them religious professionals, or sacred religious professionals who are involved in one way or another with the ceremonial, religious, and cultural life of these different communities and all. The native, the Pueblo, for instance, their religious life is very much associated with the locality of the different Pueblos they come from, as is the case here in Laguna and Acoma. Very specific to that. And even though the Pueblos share a certain kind of religious hegemony and cultural hegemony, even among themselves, there are a lot of differences. For instance, 4 unrelated separate languages are spoken here in the 19 New Mexico Pueblo, groups and all. 4 separate, unrelated. The most widely spoken is the Kerstiens language, or Kerstiens in Spanish. And so there again, my own experience was recognizing when I go into the different facilities that I would volunteer in, whether on the county level, the state level, or even the federal level. I've come across different Pueblans and Navajo and Apache, and also other Native Americans who have moved to the Southwest from other parts of the country, from the north, and from many of them being Lakota, many of them being Blackfoot from the northern states here in this country. I began to realize that that they were in many ways very much deprived of the need to be in contact with their people and in contact in one way or another with those who govern the ceremonial complexes of their particular people, pueblos and peoples and all. So, in addition to working with the Hispanic populations, the Anglo populations out here, and having my experience here in Laguna and Acoma as well, to a much lesser degree on the Jemez Pueblo, and even and more so on the Navajo, that in order for a lot of these these inmates in the different facilities I would go to, that they need to have their needs addressed, their religious needs, their cultural needs and all. And I began to realize that, we would have to find some kind of way to address this, and happily, given my own personal experience, I would have a way to do that, because living here in Laguna, for instance, we Franciscan friars have been traditionally very much involved in the cultural and at different times of the year, the ceremonial religious life of our people here. At different times of the year, it's how we oftentimes explain it, is Catholic ways and the Native ways kind of converge with each other. They don't melt and come together, but they kind of converge and share a certain time together. And then when that time ends, then there's a separation and all that. One of the things I'd like to discuss too is the idea of dual religious belonging. It's a very important facet to the Native peoples out here in the Southwest, particularly the Pueblo groups. Dual religious belonging is a theological term that was developed by the Vietnamese Roman Catholic theologian Peter Pham. And he even goes so far as to talk about tri-religious belonging as well, referring primarily to Asians in general, to the Vietnamese, to Koreans and other Asian populations that do, in fact, even Christians and Catholics are very much involved, in other religious expressions such as Buddhism, the local beliefs that and traditions there in China, for instance. And it's not unusual, for instance, in Japan, for Catholics to go to local Shinto shrines or even go to Buddhist monasteries and Buddhist temples to offer prayers and the like, and as part of their cultural life and part of their cultural and national identity as well. And we got something very, very similar here in the Southwest. Native peoples will talk about their native ways and their Catholic ways. It's a very common way to express it. I heard one wise man describe it as two oxen pulling one cart. Two separate but related ways that convey one cart in the same direction. It's one way to describe it. For a lot of Americans, that's a difficult thing to understand, to comprehend. That you can belong to two different religious traditions and you don't necessarily experience a big conflict with all that. So, one of the things I'd like to express in all this is, oftentimes Native Americans are kind of tossed together with other Native Americans in different facilities. And, it's not unusual, if you've done any kind of prison work at all, for ethnic groups and racial groups to identify with each other and spend time with each other and all. And oftentimes, being deprived of direct contact with their own Native ways in their own communities, they will, connect with each other. I've seen that. Connect with each other and encourage each other along their own Native ways and their own kind of individual Native traditions and all. There's a real a positive connection that I've seen time and time again in the different facilities I've been in. By and large, the Pueblo peoples in here in New Mexico, if they're not nominally Catholic in some way or another, and I don't mean that in any derisive way, I mean, more and more Catholics in our country are, in fact, in many ways, kind of nominally Catholic. But they they feel a strong connection with their Catholic ways as well as with their native ways. And as I mentioned before too, even though it's difficult for many Americans to understand that, they don't experience a big conflict with that. And quite frankly, as I mentioned before, dual and tri-religious belonging is actually more of the case throughout the world, in most places, on most continents and all that. Even in Indonesia, from what it's been related to me, I mean, a highly Muslim population, but a huge portion of those people also practice inherited native ways. It's very, that's a part of their life, perhaps to the chagrin of more traditionally oriented Muslim peoples in the Middle East. And that is the case, that a large percentage of Muslims throughout the world do practice another stream of religiosity that is not necessarily associated with Islam. That came as a great surprise to me as I began to learn more about this. I can't think of anything else to really bring into this regarding my own experience and all, save the fact that and working with Native Americans who are in fact incarcerated has been a real blessing for me personally, because I get a chance to bring my own experience, working with Native Americans into that ministry, into the priestly ministry I do, and my ministry also as a Franciscan friar. I'm very happy to say that my own personal life has been very enriched by my many years of experience here in Laguna Nakama and elsewhere, and that I'll never be the same. It's an honor that I'm able to participate in the lives, especially the religious and ceremonial life here in Laguna Nakama, and my relationships have, over time, they deepen and they grow. As it can take Native Americans a little while to come to trust you and to have confidence in you and all that. I remember, early on, I had an Nakama woman come up to me and say to me, "I can tell you like Indians. You're welcome here." That meant everything. That's the kind of statements that they would make. And we're very happy to have you here among us. And I'm very happy to hear things like that, because it helps them to realize that the church, the institutional church, rather, I should probably say, is making every effort to be on their side, and to support our Native American communities and all. And I can't think of anything else to say at this moment.
Oh, thank you, Father Chris. I really appreciate you particularly naming the dual religious identification. And as you mentioned, that's something that's happening all over the place, right? And it's something that I think we as ministers can sometimes forget when we're in our places where we're ministering. And so I'm curious, Father Mike, Father Chris, Ty, in your experiences working with First Nations peoples and in those communities, how have you accompanied or walked with or ministered to people who do have that sort of dual religious identification, if not in word, at least in practice?
Well, myself and another Franciscan friar, here in residence here in Laguna, that accompaniment occurs, through just our being residents here on the lands. And, there's not a lot of non-Indians in residence here, for instance, in Laguna, and even fewer in Acoma. And, in our role as pastoral ministers in particular, which is has been our traditional role here. We learn to, we, again, like as well, let me talk about this, at different times of year, at different times of major feast days. Again, the formal liturgies of the Catholic Church kind of converge with the religious practices and cultural practices of our people here. Just recently, for instance, we have the Feast of All Souls, a very, very important feast day here in Laguna Nakama, and I'm pretty sure just about all the New Mexican Pueblo communities and pueblos and all. Again, it's a very important day in which not only are the dead remembered, they're honored, and very importantly, they're fed. Food is offered them, and it's a sign of our communion with those who have passed on before us. That relationship has not ended, that it continues on, and the offering of food. And I tell you, nothing happens here in any of the pueblos without food and lots of it. Birthdays and anniversaries and all. In this traditional world, food figures big time into everything. But foods are offered on the graves of their Franciscans. We have 3 friars buried here on the parish property here in Laguna, and we see to it that they get fed as well. Traditional foods with native chile and different kinds of vegetables and different kinds of fruits that are familiar to our people out here and part of the cultural life and all. So does that kind of answer the question?
Yes, it is. Thank you, Father Chris. I appreciate that. And we have one question that came in on the chat here that I'd like to throw out there, and then we'll pass it on over to Ty to hear about some of his experiences. And the question comes from Mark, and he's asking, is this dual religious nature something that is honored in the prisons and jails where you've ministered to or accompanied those who are affected by incarceration? And if, formally or informally, what has that looked like from your perspective?
Father Michael, why don't you?
From my brief history, I haven't had a lot of experiences working in prisons and jails, but my brief work with them just tells me that in a lot of, and there's some different people work in different ways, but for prisons and jails is that they treat people the same. They're just an inmate, and they do have some cultural inclusion. Some are just mandated that they have to do, but in terms of adapting to, as Father Chris is talking about, these different cultures that are vastly different. Even the Pueblo are vastly different than Navajo. The prison system is just not capable or has no desire to enculturate with the natives. And then the extra step is to adapt to different religions. For a lot of jails and prisons, it's if you're one or the other. And that's it. They don't have a mindset of having, somebody can be part of two. It goes to a story when I was working in Shiprock. I was just talking to one of the altar servers who just celebrated Mass. I just asked him what he was going to do in the afternoon. He was going to a way, which is traditionally a Navajo celebration that is very different than the Catholic Church. In fact, different theology. But for him, as Father Chris said, it's whatever works. I mean, I can worship with the Catholic Church in the morning and then celebrate my native spirituality and my native religion in the afternoon. And that's, for me, that would be a conflict. But for a lot of native communities, that's just not a conflict.
I'd like to add to that, here in New Mexico, understanding itself as kind of a unique world, you'll find, it's kind of a hybridization. I'm hesitant to use that word, but there's been a certain blending culturally in a lot of different ways here. So, for instance, you might go to one facility, a state of New Mexico facility, where you might witness a certain sensitivity to the needs of of the Native American populace. Not all together, but it's very likely that those who run the facility, and perhaps even the warden, him or herself, is aware, being New Mexicans themselves, as some of what I just talked about and all. That there are many federal and state laws that govern this. That, for instance, if you are a Jehovah's Witness, for instance, and the Jehovah's Witnesses are very, very active within the places of incarceration. You must be given access to the ministers of that faith, for instance. If you are a Pueblan, it's perhaps maybe if you're visited by one of the traditional specialists, who I hesitate to call them priests or anything like that, but they are, they are the ones who are the cultural and religious representatives. It's not likely, I would love to see more of that. However, I haven't seen much of that. So again, there's a tacit respect and understanding. However, with the next administration that comes in, or different types of key administrative people come and go, they could be replaced with people who have no understanding or no care about any of that. But at the same time, for instance, I've seen in the state system, to serve Muslim inmates, for instance, many chaplains go to great lengths to see that they get the ministry they need. So, they, of course, here in New Mexico, so many people, if they're not Catholic, they come from Catholic backgrounds. And that's become a certain vernacular out here. Traditional forms of Hispanic-oriented types of Catholicism. And, the Native Americans out here can connect in with that. And, it varies. It varies from place to place, facility to facility, and it's very much dependent on the kind of the cultural sensitivity of those administrators who run the place. Mm-hmm. That's a long-winded response, and I apologize.
Thank you, Father Chris. I appreciate that. Ty, I'd like to pass on over to you. Being of the First Nations and Native American yourself, I think we'd love to hear some of your experiences and hear about the work that you're doing.
Okay, thank you, Father Mike and Father Chris. I wasn't answer some of those questions or that question, but I'll add it into my presentation here because it does go along with that, with the dual religion and the practices that we do here. So first of all, again, my name is Titus Fragura. I'm from the Pueblo of Jemez, better known as Walatoa. We're the only tribe in the nation, in the world, that speaks the language. No other tribe, no other race, nothing like that. We're the only the tribe that speaks this language, and it's Toa. And so to give you an insight that if we lose our language, it'll be forever gone. We don't have a real language. It's not written, it's all oral. And so we don't have books, we don't have anything like that. But nowadays, our kids are more fluent in English. And so there has to be some sort of way for us to use that technology, the books and stuff like that, to keep our language alive, And for myself, I'm actually, my English is actually my second language. Toa is my first language growing up. I was born and raised here, both my parents. I have 4 other siblings, which are all male, no females in our family. My father was a counselor for 18 years, and my mother was a stay-at-home mom. I grew up in a very good community. a very good family. My father is a recovering alcoholic. I didn't see him, being an alcoholic, because when I was born, he actually had quit after a year I was born. And so from there on, he actually, my older brothers did see that side of him. The different difficulties and issues of, being an alcoholic, and so even themselves living in poverty as a little, as well, which Father Mike had presented in his presentation. Being that is, he did, recover and become to be a well-respected counselor in the community, being taking that position for 18 years. Even till today, people still come up to him and ask him for advice, coming to talk to him. But it's unfortunate that my dad right now, he has a disability, he can't hear. So in order for him to, he can't really comprehend and, understand what the individual is talking, because he can't understand them, you can't hear them. And so that's come to where people are kind of like, really not coming to him as much as they used to. People would come middle of the night, knock on his door, wanting to talk to him. And so he's respected well in the community. He's also a cultural leader in our community. And so with his background, I think I've become to come where I'm at today. And so my history, like I said, going in that, being in that family, there's the alcoholism wasn't there. My mom never drank, my dad never drank, my brothers, drank, but I was too young for me to be with them or to experience. I did experience my uncles and, fighting, stuff like that, when they were intoxicated, but other than that, there was pretty much it, I was too young. Until when I was growing up, I was in high school, I was a star basketball player in high school. And so a lot of it came easy to me as far as being knowledge and being a star basketball player. I had a lot of leeway, I had a lot of freedom, in college, high school. And so to where, even at a young age, my father raised me on the farms, doing hard labor, going for wood and stuff like that. So, and when I was in, by ninth grade, summertime, I actually got a job, a very good labor job, until where I actually made enough money to buy a vehicle for myself for when I was in high school. And so I was able to drive a vehicle back and forth, which was good in a way, but it was bad because I had a lot of freedom. I was easy access for me to, to gain more friends, a lot of manipulation. And so growing up in high school, I had other friends that were, not positive. They're more of a bad influence to me. And so I turned to, at a young age, alcoholism. And so, during the high schools, basketball games, dances, weekends, alcohol was involved, and of course, like I said, I was a star player. I had a lot of freedom and nothing was really, and there was no much punishment, and so forth. And so, but being that is, that's through high school, my goals and dreams was to go into the military. Right after high school, 2 weeks into high school, I got in trouble. I got in trouble with my first DWI, and which it prevented me from going to the military. And being that is I at a young, I became a young father. At age 21, I became a young father. Instead of pursuing my dreams and goals to being in the military, I had to stay home and take care of my son. And so that was it. I found myself working odd jobs, labor jobs, and not really finding my place. Still alcoholism involved in my life, even though I was a father. And so I kind of went a different direction, where my father, like, a counselor for 18 years, you would think, I can be in good hands, and good path and stuff like that. But I actually took a different route, And so right after high school, we actually moved into the city. So I became an urban Indian at that time. And then I lived in the city for about maybe 14 years. And so I lived that life as an urban Indian, but still came home on the weekends when stuff was going on. And so when I found myself at a young age, like, going through my first DWI and having some pretty major charges, of course, not making the right decisions, being intoxicated, I'm not fully, in the right state of mind, saying different things, different words, assaulting a police officer, stuff like that. So those were like some major charges. But being that it was my first charge, so a lot of it was dropped, and the only thing that was kept was the DWI. And so I did do the probation and did all that, the year probation and stuff like that. And so I went through all that course, and so I got out of it, got out of probation, continue, working and stuff like that. And into where I found another job, which is going to be a wildland firefighter. Working in Bandelier, Los Alamos, New Mexico, working there as an engine crew member and also a Helitek member. And so, being on my background of not being, no stranger to hard work, I found firefighting a lot easier for me. I worked the chainsaws. I became very, proactive in the firefighting, and also just in my community. And so, a lot of it that came easy to me, and which again, it came in easy to me, a lot of things were more open for me. Again, in firefighting, you meet a bunch of other men, in the fields, or even women, and alcohol was our thing during the weekends, and so that kind of led up to, it never really stopped, it just continued to progress and, and escalate, to a lot of different issues and problems. I lost my son. I lost the relationship, because I split with the mother, and my son went with his mom to somewhere out to a different location. So I lost that connection at a young age, and so being through the firefighting, again, drinking a lot, partying, and so forth, and living back in Albuquerque, I found myself getting into another second DWI, to where I found myself in a deeper hole, to where it was my second one. And also, losing a vehicle, losing my job. At the time, during the summer, I had gone to school for a fire technician to be, to educate myself as far as, firefighting. And so I had that background, but unfortunately, all that came to a halt when I got my second DWI. But throughout the process, my father, being that he was a counselor, and being empathetic and being loving, he was a great support system for me, and helped me through the process of all that, and which I know a lot of people in the community, a lot of Native community, they don't have that support system, which I did, which I was blessed and benefited from that. When I was incarcerated, I was back and forth, meeting friends, bad influences. I was in and out of jail through probation, to a point to where the last time I remember going into jail, walking through the jail cell, I saw a window, and you can see the reflection from the window. It's not like a mirror directly visual, but you can see a reflection of your face through the window. And I talked to myself, and I told myself in my negative language, "You're back in again," talking to myself through that reflection. Until then, and that point, I made that commitment to where I don't want to be there. I want to, change my life, take care of my kids, and at that time, I already had another daughter, my younger daughter, and she was already maybe like 6 months at that time, and so I actually went through a program when I was incarcerated, went to a program. I was in there for, I think overall in and out, about 6-7 months altogether. So I knew the incarceration life pretty well, and it's amazing how you can adapt in while you're incarcerated. The things that you take for granted, even just a cup, a bowl or a spoon, a microwave, things like that, you take for granted, when you're in there. I was surrounded by 100 other inmates, in an open cell, and when I was in there, I actually experienced a lot of suicide, men committing suicide themselves in the jail, a lot of fights, gang, members and, fighting, stuff like that. I don't know the prison life, but I know well of the jail life, and even when I was in there, being a Native American, and it's amazing to see the different ethnic groups that are in there and how they can take control over the different pods in there. And when I was in there, we had a good number of Native Americans, which I was protected. Now I was protected by any other race because we had a high number of the group that was in there, And so being that is, we had kind of controlled the whole pod, and then had our different practices that were in there, we're allowed to practice some of those stuff, And so one of them was actually having a talking circle that we had in there, which is it's more of a behavioral health, AA theory, talking circle, but it was away from other ethnic groups, and we were separated from the rest of the group into a little small group of all Native American, all different races, all different tribes, but all we all did the talking circle. We had like a circle, we all sat in a circle. We made a feather out of a box. And normally you would have the eagle feather, because the eagle feather is a very spiritual animal to us. It's a very spiritual being to us. Eagle means a lot to us, but in that sense, being incarcerated, we don't have an eagle feather. We have a box that was cut into like an eagle feather. And so we did have some of that, while I was in jail. We had the talking circle. And I believe when I was in there, there was a gentleman that was in there trying to advocate for the Native Americans, where he wanted to have a drum in there, but which I don't think it never happened, to where the drum was never incorporated into the practices of the Native Americans. But even when I was in there, I met some interesting people. I'm a talker. I like to talk to people. I like to ask questions. Even I was more had my father's inner instincts of somebody needing help or somebody needing support. And when I was in jail, like I said, I didn't grow up in a bad home. We lived in a good home. Compared to somebody that lives in poverty, and somebody lives through a harsher life, to where they end up in jail. I was the opposite. I lived in a good home. I lived in a good family, and so, but I found myself incarcerated, because my own decisions, my own behaviors, and so I actually met some good friends still today. I have them as friends. We made a bond, and we made like a brotherhood kind of type, with them. We still connect, we still talk, they're good, some are as fortunate as I am, to where I'm able to recover from alcoholism, But when I was in jail, a lot of times I said, I talk to people, and maybe 90% of the time it's alcoholism is the reason why they're incarcerated or in jail, or even drugs. This is a story of a young Navajo man that I was incarcerated with, and so he was one of the trustees. And if you're a trustee, they've been in it for a long time, and he was getting prepared to be sent to a prison. And so one day he was sitting on the steps, and I went over to him, I talked to him, and I don't recall his name, but I talked to him, and he was down, his head was down, he looked like he had a bad day, And I went over to them, and I talked to him like, hey, how things going? Like, what's going on? You need someone to talk to, to where he actually came out and talked to me like it was his daughter's birthday. So he was having a bad day because it was his daughter's birthday, and he told me the story of why he was in jail. And the reason why he was in jail is because when he lived in Albuquerque, him and his brother were fighting over one beer. Whoever has to have the last beer, and they were fighting over one beer. And the daughter was trying to prevent them from fighting, and she went out looking for help. In the process, the daughter got hit and died. And then and so I always tell people, like, it's not just one beer. It's one beer could be a lot to someone else, And so he's in jail right now, and he's going to prison. I believe he got like 24 years of prison life because of what happened. Not only he's going to prison, he lost his daughter, And so, so that happened, and a lot of things happened in jail that I saw, like a lot of different things, and
Yeah.
But overall, like, it's my dad always tells me there's a reason for everything, and there's a purpose for everything that happens in life. And this was my life, my path of what happened, to where I come to here. I'm sitting here today, talking to all y'all, and even just being here, sitting at this position as my, I found myself to come out of jail, did the whole process of going through probation, finished it, and which is, and again, I'm going to go back to where I was in jail and when I came out from probation. I mean, when I was in jail, so I came out on a Thursday night. I came out on a Thursday night. I had a girlfriend at the time. Again, she was a bad influence. And it was me. It was my decisions to be in that position as well too. I came out of jail on a Thursday night. And, Friday morning, I went, saw my probation officer early in the morning. I said, like, I'm gonna go see my probation officer early in the morning, 8 o'clock in the morning, so then I can be done with it for the weekend, and I'll be free for the weekend, And going in and seeing my probation officer, and then she was happy for me. It's a female probation officer. She was happy for me that I got out, and then she was writing on her paper, and she was writing down, looking down, and she asked me, and she was like, how'd you get here? And me with the excitement, just being excited, just to be out and, trying to get this over with. And I slipped out and said, I drove. And she stopped writing, and she looked at me, and she's like, you what? And in my head, I was like, man, I just caused myself another jail. And, and she's right away, she picked up the phone, called the guards, and right back after, I believe I was in there for maybe like 6 months or so when it happened. And, I only came out one night and ended back in jail for another week. And so what happened was, the long story short, my girlfriend at the time had planned a party for a welcome home party for being home. And, it's so unfortunate that things happened at that party where the police were called, EMTs were called. And I look back today, I'm thinking like, I'm actually, God was looking after me. He was telling me I was not ready to be home at that time, because that was going to happen that evening. If that would not happen, if I would not said I drove, I would have ended up staying home that Friday night and end up partying again. And so in my sense, somebody was looking after me, God was looking after me to where he was telling me I'm not ready, to where you have another week in jail. I didn't realize at that time what that meant, until like today, like I look back. I've been, I'm a recovering alcoholic so my sobriety is over 10 years, or going on 11 years now. So I've been sober for 11 years. And so when that happened, I look back, so that was a blessing for me, and so I still continue my sobriety. And until today, I was fortunate to go back to school. I got my associates in human services. I got my bachelor's in social services, social work. And I'm here today, working for my own community. And so that's long story short for my experience being incarcerated. But when I was incarcerated, like a lot of things happened that I'm really blessed to be here today, and even like for me, I take every opportunity, regardless if it was incarcerated, to take it to a positive for myself. I'm the person to take sarcasm and then turn it to positive. And so in a way, being my life, being incarcerated, I took it as a positive, that way I can come back and teach and the people that are in my same boat that I was in, So because I do have a lot of other friends and males, females that do come to me and ask me for advice or ask me for just opinions. And, I always turn back to like what I went through in life, and how much, the trouble in just losing a family, and just not being there for my kids, because I was incarcerated, losing jobs, and I could write a book if I could, but like I said, long story short, I'm here today, being a prevention service specialist here at Human Social Services. It's a new job that I'm having right now. It's actually fairly new. I actually got it Monday. So I was a battered intervention specialist for 2 years here at Social Services, which I taught classes for offenders and perpetrators for domestic violence. We just had a domestic violence conference last month, which we had over 100 participants virtually, which is it's a challenge thing for us. We're having it virtually because we're used to having it, in a setting to where everybody's gathered, And so I've been fortunate to have this role and have this position. And even before that, I was actually a probation officer for little over 3 years. I was a probation officer for a little over 3 years. Even when I was a probation officer, I wore 2 hats. I wore a probation officer hat and I wore a social service hat, because, knowing that, I don't like to judge people because I'm no better to judge anybody because of what I've gone through and what I've done in my life. I'm not going to judge people. I'll be an advocate for them. I can support them as much as I can. And so when I was going to school, I actually worked for, I worked for Thresholds. So I'm not too sure if anybody knows the program Thresholds, but it's a reintervention program for reincarcerated, men or females to come back into society. And we did casework and stuff like that with them. And so that was pretty amazing to work for. I worked with 2 individuals that had, charges of murder, but were reintegrated back into society. And we helped them out, with jobs, schooling, whatever that might have been. So that was a really good experience for me, and throughout my life. And so, and just going back to, and then just talking about the dual religion that we had discussed earlier. So here in Jemez, we have dual religion. We have our native traditions, and we also have our Catholic religions. We actually incorporate both into our dances, our songs, and stuff like that. And so every event, most of the events we do have are based out of either the Catholic religion. We have Easter, we have Christmas, we have the 3 Kings. We all dance those. Matter of fact, we have our feast day coming up tomorrow, which is going to be our annual feast day, our Jemez feast, which we actually do honor our saints as well too. So November 12th is our Jemez feast. And so if you're not familiar with Jemez feast, it's a big gathering with hundreds of dancers, men dancing on the plaza. If you can see the background here, that's the background of where I'm from. You see the white sand and the red sand in the back. That's where the back for my reservations at. And so feast day is November 12th for us, which is Jemez feast. We honor the saints. We have a big dancing for honor the saints. We have dances, singing. It's a big festival. We have arts and crafts. It's a big celebration that we do have, that we have incorporated from the Catholic Church. And we have mass in the morning. We bring out the mass, we bring out the saint, we set them into a little shrine that we have, and we dance for the shrine, we dance for the saints for our festivals. So we have that. So a lot of our tradition is incorporated into dual religion. Like I said, we have Christmas. We have beautiful Christmas dances. I believe, Father Chris, you have noticed or observed the Christmas dance. It is a beautiful dance. So if anybody gets a chance to come during Christmas or either the next day of Christmas, it is a beautiful dance. You will not regret coming and seeing the dance. It is a beautiful dance. And like I said, a lot of it, we incorporate the Catholic Church into our own religion. Even our prayers, we actually mentioned the Catholic Church, as we are fortunate to have 2 blessings, our native blessings and also our Catholic religion blessings. And so we incorporate a lot of that into our native culture. So to kind of answer that question of the dual religion, that's just how Jemez, and a lot of the tribes do as well too. And so that's the dual religion that we do have. And so
thank you, Ty.
Yeah,
I apologize. I don't mean to cut you off. I appreciate the stories that you're sharing and your own story and some of the practices of your community and others' communities.
Yeah.
we're past our time, so I'm sorry to have to cut off the conversation. It's good for us to hear these things and to learn more as ministers in these spaces. So before we close out today, I just wanted to offer our thanks to all three panelists here, Father Chris, Father Michael, and Ty. Thank you for your time and your experiences and your wisdom that you've shared with the group. And just as a bit of a commercial coming up here, I just wanted to draw your attention to a few things that we have coming up. Here at the end of the month on the 18th, we have Open Wide Our Hearts, a conversation on racism with Zuri Davis, who's a criminal justice reform activist and former journalist. She'll be having a conversation with us on how to, as ministers, how do we engage with the topic of racism and the racism that we encounter in the spaces where we minister. And then coming up here in Advent, you'll actually be seeing the launch of an education packet that we're working on called Who Do You Say That I Am? It is a faith, a Lenten guide launching here in Advent so that small communities, organizations, and parishes can prepare for the Lenten season to have a resource to guide a conversation about incarceration and what our faith demands of us in that space. So I'll pop some of those links into the chat. And I appreciate everyone's attention today and attendance, and we'll be seeing you all next time. So thank you all very much, and we'll see you at the next webinar.